We can also look at the economic toolbox. Here, we already have sanctions in place on Russian energy exports and on financial institutions. These have never been vigorously enforced as they could be. And I think there would be an effort to try to turn the screws economically to get Putin to the table.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the former US Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis and served as US Special Representative for Ukraine. Ambassador, we always appreciate your time. Welcome back to Frontline.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
First of all, what is your reaction to the big news we've had breaking in the last 24 hours, this agreement between the US and Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire?
Yeah, well, I think it's very, very good because it gets the US and Ukraine back in alignment again. That's what we hope to see with President Zelensky's visit to the Oval Office 11 days ago. Instead, we had a blow up between the US and Ukraine, and it's taken a little bit of time to put this back together. But now we have a commitment by Ukraine and the United States to supporting an immediate ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire. We have resumption of U.S. military support and intelligence conditioned on the idea that Ukraine is seeking a ceasefire, seeking peace. And we are progressing on this minerals deal. We expect it to be signed by the leaders at some point coming soon. As Secretary Rubio pointed out, it's the Treasury Secretary and his counterpart who've been working on this, not the Secretary of State and Foreign Minister. So that is also moving ahead. This is very good because it helps turn the spotlight to where it should be, which is on Russia's continued war against Ukraine. And we just had another missile and drone barrage against Ukraine overnight after the proposal for the ceasefire was announced. And I think that this shows what the state of the war is, who is responsible for it, what needs to happen if you really want peace, which is Russia has to stop attacking Ukraine.
What are the chances, in your view, that Russia will agree to this ceasefire?
I think Russia will say something along the lines of yes, but. It's like, well, yes, we're willing to think about a ceasefire. However, we need this and that and that. They're going to create new issues and demand things in exchange for just doing what they're being asked to do right now. And I hope that what President Trump does is keep it simple. He has done so all along thus far. He said he just wants to stop the killing, end the carnage, as he says. And that's what Russia needs to do, just stop the fighting. After that, there's a lot of time and opportunity to talk about more issues aimed at a peace agreement. But in the short term, it really should be an immediate ceasefire.
But from what we know, Putin has set out demands for a lasting deal that appear to be impossible for Ukraine to accept: a ban on European peacekeepers, international recognition for the territories occupied by Russia. Is he really going to compromise on those terms just because Trump wants him to?
Well, I think there's an in-between, which is we get a ceasefire. We can reinforce and strengthen that with, for instance, POW exchanges. We can extend it in duration. And you may end up with a situation where we don't have an agreement with Russia because Russia does have these absolutist demands, but you can have an end to the fighting. And I think that is something that would be acceptable from a Ukrainian point of view, is a permanent end to the fighting, reinforce deterrence so that Putin is not tempted to attack again, and a long-term dispute with Russia over Russia's occupation of parts of Ukraine.
We'll come on to what that long-term deterrence may be in due course. But if Vladimir Putin does not agree to this 30-day ceasefire plan, what do you think we will see from the US in response? Will they be ramping up pressure on Putin? And if so, what will that look like?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a continuation of military and intelligence support that we're already providing. And President Trump indicated that yesterday in his press remarks already, that if Putin doesn't agree, we'll just keep going and a lot of people will get killed. And then I think I'll also look at the economic toolbox. Here, we already have sanctions in place on Russian energy exports and on financial institutions. These have never been vigorously enforced as they could be. And I think there would be an effort to try to turn the screws economically to get Putin to the table.
I mean, what we have seen now is the US saying they will resume intelligence sharing and security cooperation, which presumably means military aid to Ukraine for the time being. But of course, that is just restoring the status quo, as it were. That is just restoring what was the situation until a week or so ago. So do you think if Putin refuses to play ball and refuses to agree to this 30-day ceasefire, the US could go further than that and do, as Keith Kellogg once threatened, and arm Ukraine to the teeth.
Yeah. I think when you say restore the status quo, it is with one big difference, is that you now have a commitment by Ukraine with the US to have a ceasefire. And this is something that President Trump has pushed for, is the idea that there ought to be an end to the fighting. So the armament of Ukraine is really conditioned on that. And I think as long as Ukraine stays in that position, I think there will be continued flow of arms and support for Ukraine, and possibly even an increase, as you say, because the idea is to get Putin to that same position.
But does it not need to be even more support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, to back Putin into a corner, to force him to the negotiating table? Because prior to the military aid being paused and the intelligence sharing being paused, a lot of people would say Ukraine was being given enough not to lose, but wasn't being given enough to win. And Vladimir Putin and the Russians were able to make incremental advances in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that there was enough aid going to Ukraine. They were blunting the Russian advances regularly, causing lots and lots of casualties on the Russian side, eliminating a lot of equipment. They were actually holding the front line reasonably well. And they have been developing their own defense capabilities, such as their own long-range drones, which they used a couple of days ago in Moscow. So I think that the things were not as bad for Ukraine as your question kind of indicates. They were doing okay. They were holding their own. Very difficult because of manpower. And what more the U.S. could do, I think that there might be additional types of armaments. There might be a little bit faster supply that we could do. But I think the U.S. was really, by the end of the Biden administration, early Trump administration, indeed leaning in to give Ukraine more of what they need.
But surely, even now, there is no real reason for Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table unless the US were to significantly ramp up military aid to Ukraine, because he would say, look, our forces are still making gradual gains on the front line in Ukraine. Why does he need to negotiate?
I think the main reason that he needs to negotiate is actually on the economic side rather than on the military side. They have been burning through their foreign exchange reserves. They're down to about $30 billion or less dollars. That's enough to sustain them through this autumn, perhaps, unless they make some serious changes. They are facing increasing difficulties with getting revenue from their oil and gas sales. That's something that the U.S. can indeed tighten up on, particularly by pursuing secondary sanctions against those who are trading in Russian oil and gas. So, as I think we pointed out earlier, but the inflation in Russia is very, very high right now, as are interest rates. There's a labor shortage as well. He's having difficulty then converting an economic position into support for his military. So I think there's a lot of reasons why Putin needs to take a pause in this war by the end of this year. I think Trump knows that. I think that's why he's keeping the pressure on. And I think if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire in the near term, that's why you'll see more use of the economic toolbox.
Does Trump really know that, though, Ambassador? Because, I mean, he has said publicly that Russia hold all the cards in this. He doesn't seem to be sensing the economic weakness of Vladimir Putin.
No, he corrected himself. He keeps talking about cards, and he said Ukraine doesn't have any cards, or with us you have cards, but only with us we have the cards. You don't have the cards, and then Russia has the cards. And then yesterday, I guess it was the day before yesterday, he said neither side has any cards. So I don't know what happened to the cards.
There will be those who say, why was US intelligence sharing ever paused to Ukraine, given what we've seen in the towns and cities of Ukraine in the past week or so, with Russia ramping up its horrendous bombardment of those locations, leading to an increased loss of life. Why did the White House see fit to pause intelligence sharing?
Well, President Trump said this himself on the Friday after Zelensky left the White House. He said that he was not convinced that Zelensky actually wanted to have peace, that if we continue to provide arms and support, that they would use that to fight. And so he wanted to hear from Zelensky in a convincing way that, yes, if we support you, you are going to be seeking a peace. And I think that has now happened, that Zelensky has done that. They had the meeting in Jeddah yesterday that appears to have gone well. We've now reached agreement on a ceasefire proposal. So I think that is back in alignment again. But that is the reason why Trump suspended military aid and intelligence support for a period of time. The U.S. says that it withheld offensive intelligence, but not defensive. And I think that's really not such a bright line between the two. Intelligence is a lot of knowing the force posture and the movements of the other side, whether they are attacking you and whether you are evading those attacks or preemptively striking them. It is all of one piece. And I just have to say, I don't know any of the details here, but I do think that it may have been in particular related to the Kursk region, where Russia was able to use some maneuvers to advance against Ukrainian forces that were holding that area of Kursk. And maybe they were blind there when that was happening. But in terms of air defense and cities, it seems that the intelligence sharing is on and that Ukraine is able to provide air defense for civilians as best it can.
But as a former special representative to Ukraine, were you comfortable with that decision to pause intelligence sharing?
Well, no, because I do view it as the ability to defend civilians against these air assaults that Russia launches every night. And they're massive. There are hundreds of either missiles or drones that are fired at Ukraine every night, and they do need to defend themselves. And I think one of the things that I'm always struck by is the differentiation when people talk about Ukraine and people talk about Israel. We make a big deal about the hostages that Hamas has taken or Hezbollah had taken. And we don't make a big deal about the hostages that Russia has taken and the children that they've abducted. Likewise, we weighed in directly to help protect Israel from air attacks by Iran. Yet we are holding back from doing that when it is airstrikes, even with the same weapons, against Ukraine. So there does seem to be a bit of a differentiation there in the way we view this. Possibly the reason is nuclear weapons and people are more cautious about confronting Russia directly. But in terms of understanding the stakes of this, it is very similar. And holding back on things like intelligence and military support really don't make sense in this context.
The comparison with Israel is very interesting. I've seen some people say that there are elements of the MAGA right and the very online right who have a pathological hatred for Zelensky in Ukraine that almost mirrors how some on the far left have a pathological hatred for Israel. Do you see that comparison?
That's an interesting point. Certainly on the far right, there are those who do just hate Zelensky and they want to see Zelensky go. And you do have that on the far left with Netanyahu. So there is a similarity there.
I mean, others would say the problem is it's not just people online. It is bleeding into the White House. And what we saw with that blow up in the Oval Office with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump raising their grievances dating back to the Mueller investigation, dating back to the circumstances around Donald Trump's first impeachment, feeds into these kind of baseless conspiracies that Ukraine is somehow this corrupt neo-Nazi regime.
Yeah, I don't think that is really the White House view here. I think what you saw in the White House meeting, you had a situation where the president had a very warm welcome of Zelensky. They were sitting down, preparing to have a good meeting. They were going to sign the minerals deal. They were then going to have lunch. And instead, J.D. Vance wanted to say something so he could be on camera. And President Zelensky, instead of just waving that off, as he could easily have done, all Vance said was, we want to use diplomacy. He decided to get into an argument about, well, what kind of diplomacy and how can you negotiate with a terrorist like Putin, and you can't trust Putin, and completely unnecessary, which then caused Vance and then Trump to argue back, and it just destroyed the whole meeting. But I don't think that this is a pathological hatred of Zelensky coming from the White House or President Trump. In fact, when President Trump has spoken about Zelensky, he's often quite positive, saying he's strong, he's tough as nails, he's defending his country, he's a great salesman.
He called him a dictator.
Yeah. Well, he said that, and then he drew it back, within 2 days. So did I say that? I never said that. So that is Trump's style, is to say things, provoke people, get reactions, But I think there's actually a more serious understanding of the situation here, where they want to make sure that Ukraine is in the box, if you will, aligned with the U.S. seeking to stop the war so that they can get Putin to that same point.
Do you think we may see developing divisions within the Trump administration over their approach to Ukraine? We know, for instance, that General Kellogg takes a more hawkish view towards Russia. We know, you mentioned J.D. Vance has long wanted to see this conflict brought to an end on whatever terms. Do you think we will see those divisions develop further as this draws on?
One of the things that is striking about the Trump administration is how there is only one person who decides. And that's President Trump. So you can have different voices. In fact, I think President Trump likes to have different voices. He likes to hear different arguments, but he's the one who ultimately makes the decision. And it is always about getting to the deal. It's always about maneuvering the pieces so that he can get to a position where there's an agreement. That is what he's going to do. And I don't think it really matters so much what others are saying.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Even if Vladimir Putin were to agree to this 30-day ceasefire, it is merely a ceasefire, and that would then open the door for more formal talks about a longer-lasting peace deal. How do you rate the prospects, Ambassador, of such a longer-lasting peace deal being agreed in the near future?
Yeah, I think ceasefire, yes. Extension of a ceasefire, yes. A few accompanying steps like a POW exchange, yes. But I don't see Vladimir Putin ever giving up on his absolutist demands to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state, eliminate Ukrainian national identity, to remove Zelensky and impose his own government in Ukraine. I don't see him giving up on any of that. So I think the likelihood of an actual agreement with Russia is very low. What I do see is a possibility you could move from a tenuous ceasefire to a more stable ceasefire, and one where you continue to have differences, but they're not being resolved on the battlefield.
But if Vladimir Putin is not prepared to ultimately give up on his maximalist demands, what response, if any, do you think we will see from the US? Would they at that point be prepared to say, we will row in even more fully behind Ukraine?
I think what you're likely to see is the emergence of a deterrent capability that's combined security assurances from Europe, support for training and equipping of Ukrainians, so that continues, including from European allies. Perhaps a European force presence in Ukraine as a deterrent capability, and also assisting with development of Ukraine's own armed forces. Those sorts of, and backup from the United States, which I think will be important to the Europeans. I think those things are possible to create a deterrent. It would be great if there was actually an agreement. But given what we know about Vladimir Putin, I think that's unlikely. And I think we end up more in a East Germany, West Germany type situation where we have a long-term disagreement, but there's no fighting going on.
You mentioned backup from the United States. I mean, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has been talking about this idea of a US backstop, so that potentially you have European peacekeeping troops, probably British and French peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine, but the US providing, whether it's air cover, whether it's some final security guarantee that if Putin were to invade and threaten those peacekeeping troops, that the US would intervene then. Clearly, that's what the Europeans would like. But can you really see Trump agreeing to that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces here. We should break them down a little bit. There's what people have referred to as backbone, and there's what people have referred to as backstop. And backbone being enablers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, maybe some logistical capability to transport things through. Those sort of enablers as a backbone, that seems to me quite doable in a normal scenario where Europe deploys some forces to Ukraine but needs a bit of assistance. Then you have backup, which could be in extremis support for European forces. And this is premised on the idea that there's a ceasefire that is not being violated. And only if Russia were to violate that ceasefire and be attacking the European forces, then the US would in extremis help them out. That also seems to me to be doable. But to get there, what President Trump has insisted on is the Europeans have to put their cards on the table. They have to say what they're prepared to do. He's not going to put US forces on the table up front, because that always has the effect of then Europe working around that. And he wants Europe to actually take a lead.
And I think most analysts would certainly agree that Europe for too long has essentially been, they've been free riders off the back of American defense spending and sheltering under the American security umbrella in Europe. And it's absolutely right that the Europeans pay their own way when it comes to defense. The problem is, despite the positive mood music from Friedrich Merz in terms of increasing German defense spending as a percentage of GDP, the British proposing much the same, and we've seen expansion of Polish and Danish defense spending, the impact of that is going to take many years, maybe many decades to fully be felt. In the short to medium term, even British and French peacekeeping troops on the ground, it may not be more than a few tens of thousands, and that may not be enough to effectively deter Vladimir Putin. So do you still not need the US there in some way, shape, or form?
Yes, you don't. Remember that you have close to 1 million Ukrainian men at arms, or men and women at arms. And that is the primary deterrent. They will be there along the front lines. European forces would be present. They would be training and equipping. They would be potentially helping with air defense. And I think adding to the Ukrainian capability, but not seeking to replace it or solely deter Putin. And again, this is all premised on a ceasefire. I don't think any Europeans are thinking about putting forces in Ukraine if the war is still actively going on. It is getting to a ceasefire, providing some stabilization of that to deter an outbreak of new fighting.
Why should Ukraine, however, believe any such security guarantee? The number of times on this program we talk about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which you'll be very familiar with, where Russia, the US, and the UK ensured Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for them giving up what was their most effective deterrence, which was their nuclear weapons. And of course, we all know how the following 30 years have played out. So if you're sitting in Kyiv, why should you believe any security guarantee provided to you by the US, the West, the Europeans, the Russians?
Well, what's the alternative? The alternative is what we've got, which is no security guarantees and continued war. It's better to have security assurances, as people are talking about, and then to make those as robust and operational as possible. I don't see a better alternative. Well, I take that back. The better alternative is NATO membership and all of those things, but that is not on the table at the moment.
Or I suppose the ultimate alternative would be to give Ukraine what it needs to drive Vladimir Putin out of its sovereign territory altogether, because the lesson from history is if you do not defeat expansionist tyrants, you are storing up future problems.
Yeah, that may be true, but at the same time, I don't see President Trump or Europe willing to do that because of their fear of nuclear weapons.
You mentioned Ukrainian NATO membership. Do you think that is off the table for a generation now?
No, I think it's off the table for an administration. I think President Trump is clearly not going to support that. I hope that it just gets parked and we have alternatives instead. And then everybody gets used to the idea that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state again. It is entering, or on a process of entering, the European Union. It has a large military that the West is helping to support. The ceasefire is now stable. There may even be evolution inside Russia. So we get to a different normality. And then from that normality, I hope we come back to the issue of NATO membership as soon as practical.
As a former US ambassador to NATO, is NATO as an organization still relevant, though? Because really NATO rests on the credibility of Article 5, the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all, and the alliance will come together to defend itself. But I struggle to see a scenario in which, were Vladimir Putin to roll into, say, Lithuania, that the US would be prepared to send troops to defend Lithuania. And therefore, is Article 5 not rendered irrelevant? Is NATO not rendered irrelevant?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that there is a big difference between Russia attacking an existing NATO ally and Russia attacking Ukraine, which is not in NATO. Because the moment Russia were to attack a NATO ally, you mentioned Lithuania, but you could name many others, there would be an immediate response from NATO, including European allies, including countries like Germany. And the US would get sucked into that. There would not be any way to differentiate US support and all the other allies' support. And because of that, I think it actually deters exactly that kind of attack. So NATO is incredibly relevant because it does provide that deterrence.
Just finally, Ambassador, given the news we've had over the past 24 hours of this agreement between the US and Ukraine for a ceasefire, and now questions being put to Vladimir Putin as to whether Russia will accept it, is Putin now on the back foot in this?
A little bit. I think Putin was worried when Zelensky was going to the White House 2 weeks ago because he thought that the US and Ukraine might actually strike a deal and be in alignment, and this would bring the US more on Ukraine's side. He was delighted when that didn't happen. We all saw, the celebrations in Moscow as a result. Well, now we are back there again. We do have the US and Ukraine fully aligned about a ceasefire, about military support, about a minerals deal coming up. So I think this is of concern to Putin, and he's going to be considering how does he play this. He doesn't want to be just cast as the person saying no, but of course that's his intent, is to say no. So he's going to try to find these wedge issues, these divisive things, these ways of twisting the agreement to see how he can play that. But he's doing it from a position where he's now the one in the spotlight.
Ambassador, we always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Pleasure to be with you, James. Thanks.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.